3 rivers so far, and all 3 of them are gone. The Nile was generous, and Egypt lasted 3,000 years, and then it ended and became somebody else's province. The Tigris and Euphrates were cruel, and Mesopotamia was conquered 9 times, and won anyway, and then went silent for 1,800 years. The Indus moved, and its cities were simply left, and we still cannot read a word its people wrote. This one is different, and I want to be precise about how. The river at the center of this story is arguably the most destructive major river on the planet. It has killed more people than any other geographical feature on Earth. It has jumped its own channel and relocated its mouth by hundreds of kilometers, more than once, drowning entire provinces in the process. Its own people gave it a nickname that translates as China's sorrow. And the civilization that grew up on its banks is the only one of the 4 that never stopped, not never suffered. It has been invaded, fragmented, occupied, and torn apart by civil wars that killed tens of millions. But the thread never broke. A literate Chinese person today can look at writing carved into a turtle shell 3,500 years ago and recognize characters. Not guess at them, recognize them. Egypt, Mesopotamia, and the Indus all lost their scripts. China never did. This is the story of how that happened, and of the river that spent 4,000 years trying to prevent it. Start with the dirt, because everything here follows from the dirt. In the northwest of China, there is a plateau covered in a substance called loess. It is a fine, pale, yellowish silt, blown in over hundreds of thousands of years by winds off the deserts and mountains of Central Asia, and piled up in places to depths of over 100 meters. Loess has 2 properties that shaped everything that came after. The first is that it is extraordinarily fertile and extraordinarily easy to work. You can till it with a digging stick. You can carve houses directly into a Loess cliff, and people still do. There are villages in northern China today where families live in vaulted rooms cut straight into the hillside, cool in summer, warm in winter, and effectively free to build. Some of those dwellings have been continuously occupied for centuries. For early farmers with no metal tools, this was some of the most workable farmland on Earth. The second property is that it does not hold together. Loess erodes at a spectacular rate. Rain cuts it into gullies. Rivers carry it away in enormous quantities, and one particular river runs straight through the middle of it. The Yellow River picks up so much of this silt that at some points it is roughly a third sediment by weight. It is not a metaphor. The water is genuinely, opaquely yellow, and the river is named for it. Historically, it has carried well over 1 billion tons of sediment a year, more than any other major river in the world. Then it leaves the highlands, and the ground flattens out, and the current slows down, and all that silt has to go somewhere. It settles on the riverbed. Every year, the bed rises, so people build levees to keep the water in. The bed keeps rising, so they build the levees higher, and the bed keeps rising because the levees are trapping the sediment in the channel instead of letting it spread. Do this for a few centuries, and you get something genuinely alarming. Along stretches of its lower course, the Yellow River flows above the surrounding countryside. The riverbed sits several meters higher than the farmland and the villages on either side, held in place entirely by earthen walls. In some places the gap has reached over 10 meters. There is a river hanging above your fields, and the only thing between you and it is a mound of packed earth that somebody has to maintain forever. When those walls fail, the river does not simply flood, it leaves. It pours out across the flat plain and carves an entirely new course to the sea, sometimes hundreds of kilometers from the old one, and it stays there. Over recorded history, the mouth of the Yellow River has swung between points north and south of the Shandong Peninsula, a shift of several hundred kilometers, at least half a dozen times. The consequences are almost impossible to overstate. A flood in 1887 is estimated to have killed somewhere between 900,000 and 2 million people. The floods of 1931, affecting the Yellow River alongside others, produced death tolls estimated anywhere from 400,000 into the millions, and are frequently ranked among the deadliest natural disasters in recorded human history. And in 1938, during the war with Japan, Chinese nationalist forces deliberately breached the dikes themselves to slow the Japanese advance. It slowed them. It also drowned something in the region of 500,000 of their own civilians. That is the river. Now here is the crucial part. Egypt's Nile could be managed by a village. You dig a basin, you let the flood in, you let it out. Mesopotamia's canals needed a city to organize them. The Yellow River needs something bigger than a city, maintaining hundreds of kilometers of levee, coordinating labor across whole provinces, storing grain against the year the dikes fail. None of that works at village scale. Some historians have argued that this is not a coincidence, and that the pressure of managing this river helped push China toward large, centralized bureaucratic states earlier and more permanently than elsewhere. It is a contested idea, and you should treat it as one argument among several rather than a settled fact. But the pattern is hard to ignore. This is a river that punishes disunity. Farming villages appear along the Yellow River and its tributaries by 7,000 years ago, growing millet rather than wheat, in a culture archaeologists call Yangshao. We know them mostly through their pottery, which is painted with bold red and black designs, fish and faces and spirals, and is genuinely beautiful. Around 5,000 years ago, the picture changes. The Longshan culture appears, and with it the potter's wheel, and something quietly astonishing. Longshan potters produced black burnished vessels so thin that the walls can be well under a millimeter. It is called eggshell pottery, and it is so fragile it can only have been ceremonial. It represents a level of craft specialization that implies a society with hierarchy, surplus, and people whose whole job was making beautiful things for someone important. Longshan sites also start showing walls, rammed earth walls, big ones, which means organized labor and something worth defending and probably somebody giving orders. Then, around 3,900 years ago, a site called Erlitou appears in the Yellow River Valley, and it is a step change. Palace foundations laid on rammed earth platforms, bronze workshops, a road grid. It is the largest settlement in East Asia at the time, and it looks like a capital. Traditional Chinese history has a name for the dynasty that should occupy this period. The Xia, the first dynasty, founded by a hero called Yu the Great, whose signature achievement, appropriately enough, was controlling a catastrophic flood. Is Erlitou the Xia? Chinese archaeology has often said yes. Many Western scholars are more cautious, and their reasoning is straightforward. Erlitou has produced no writing. Without a text naming itself, we have a great city that fits the right time and place, and a legend, and no way to firmly connect them. It may well be the Xia. We cannot currently prove it, which makes what comes next so important, because with the next dynasty, the writing arrives, and the arguing largely stops. The story of how we found it is one of the better accidents in archaeology. For centuries, Chinese apothecaries sold something called dragon bones. These were old bones, dug up by farmers, ground into powder and used as medicine. Very often they had strange scratches on them, and the scratches were frequently polished off before sale because they were considered a defect. In 1899, a scholar in Beijing named Huang is said to have looked closely at a batch of dragon bones and realized the scratches were not damage. They were writing, very old writing, in a form nobody had seen. The bones were traced back to a site near Anyang in Henan province, and Anyang turned out to be the last capital of the Shang dynasty. Since then, something in the order of 150,000 inscribed fragments have been recovered. Here is what they are. Shang kings practiced divination. A specialist would take a turtle shell or an ox shoulder blade, prepare it with hollows, and apply intense heat until the bone cracked. The pattern of cracks was read as an answer. And then, crucially for us, the question was carved onto the bone, and sometimes the outcome as well. Will the harvest be good? Should the king attack this enemy? Is it safe to go hunting in the coming week? Is the king's toothache caused by an ancestor's displeasure? Will the queen's childbirth be fortunate? Will it rain? Read a few hundred of those and something strange happens. You are not reading a monument. You are reading a working king's actual daily anxieties, filed in order, over decades. It is one of the most intimate windows into any ancient court anywhere. The oracle bones also confirmed the Shang king list recorded by later Chinese historians with remarkable accuracy, which is precisely why the Xia Question stays open rather than closed. The historians got the Shang right. That is a reason to take them seriously about the Xia, and not a reason to consider it proven. The Shang left more than bones. Their bronze work is, by broad agreement, some of the finest metalwork of the ancient world, and they did it differently from everyone else. Mediterranean and Near Eastern casters mostly used the lost wax method. Shang founders used piece molds, building a clay mold in interlocking sections around a model, which allowed astonishingly crisp, deep, complex surface decoration, covering entire ritual vessels in dense, interlocking animal motifs. They were also, and there is no gentle way to phrase this, extremely violent. Shang royal tombs contain the remains of sacrificed human beings in numbers. War captives, servants, charioteers with their chariots and horses. The oracle bones themselves record sacrifices, sometimes of hundreds of people at once. Any picture of the Shang as serene ancestor worshippers has to sit alongside that. One tomb is worth pausing on. In 1976, archaeologists at Anyang found a burial that grave robbers had missed. It belonged to Fu Hao, a consort of King Wu Ding, and it contained hundreds of bronze objects and hundreds of jades, and the oracle bones tell us who she was. Fu Hao led armies. Divinations ask about her military campaigns, thousands of troops under her command, against multiple enemies. She conducted rituals in her own right. She is the earliest woman in Chinese history whose life we can document from contemporary written records, and she was a general. Around 3,000 years ago, a people from the west called the Zhou defeated the Shang in battle and took the throne. Conquest is ordinary. What the Zhou did afterwards is not, because they had a problem. The Shang kings had claimed a special relationship with the divine. If that was true, how could the Zhou have won? Their answer is one of the most consequential political ideas in human history. They called it the mandate of heaven. The argument runs like this. Heaven grants the right to rule. It grants it conditionally, on the basis of virtue and competence. A ruler who governs well keeps it. A ruler who governs badly, who lets his people starve, who ignores the floods, loses it, and heaven transfers it to someone else. The Shang had become corrupt, and so the mandate passed to the Zhou. Look at what that does. It legitimizes the new dynasty, obviously, but it also permanently establishes that rulers can be justly removed, that legitimacy depends on performance, and that a successful rebellion is itself evidence the mandate has moved. Every subsequent Chinese dynasty used this framework, including dynasties founded by conquerors from outside China entirely, who adopted it precisely because it let them be legitimate. It gave China something Egypt and Mesopotamia never developed in the same way, a portable theory of legitimate succession so that when a dynasty fell, the system did not fall with it. Someone else picked up the mandate and carried on. The Zhou ruled for a long time, formally the longest dynasty in Chinese history, but real Zhou power collapsed early. They distributed territory to relatives and allies, and over generations, those territories became independent states that fought each other while nominally honoring a Zhou king with no armies. The centuries that follow are called the Spring and Autumn period, and then, with grim honesty, the Warring States period. It is several hundred years of near-continuous conflict between states of increasing size and sophistication, ending with 7 major powers grinding against each other. And here is the paradox at the heart of Chinese history. This was the worst period of disorder yet, and it produced the greatest flowering of thought China would ever have. They call it the 100 schools of thought, and the reason is not mysterious. Dozens of competing courts, all desperate for any advantage, meant an open market for advisors with ideas about how to run a state. If one duke would not listen, you walked to the next one. Out of that market came Confucius, arguing that social order comes from ritual, hierarchy, family obligation, and rulers who lead by moral example rather than force. He was largely unsuccessful in his own lifetime and became the most influential thinker in East Asian history. Out of it came the Taoists, arguing more or less the opposite, that the striving itself is the problem and that one should act in accordance with the natural order rather than against it. Out of it came Mozi, arguing for universal impartial care for all people regardless of relationship and against offensive warfare, which was a genuinely radical position at the time. Out of it came the strategists, including the tradition that produced the art of war, which reads today less like a battle manual than a treatise on winning without fighting. And out of it came the legalists, who looked at all of the above and concluded that human beings are not fundamentally good, that moral example is useless, and that a state should be run on strict codified law, harsh punishment, reliable reward, and the systematic destruction of anything competing with the ruler's authority. The legalists were unpleasant, and they were effective. And the state that adopted their program most thoroughly was a hard, militarized Western state on the frontier called Qin. In 221 BCE, after decades of methodical conquest, the king of Qin defeated the last of his rivals and declared himself the first emperor. What he did next mattered more than the conquest. He abolished the old feudal territories and divided the empire into administrative commanderies, run by appointed officials rather than hereditary nobles. He standardized weights and measures. He standardized the currency. He standardized the width of cart axles so that wheel ruts on the roads would fit every cart in the empire, and most importantly of all, he standardized the writing. Regional scripts across the warring states had drifted apart. Qin imposed a single unified system. That decision is why written Chinese has functioned for over 2,000 years as a common medium across regions whose spoken languages are mutually unintelligible. Two people who cannot understand a word the other says can read the same page. That single administrative act is one of the deepest reasons China held together. He also connected and extended earlier northern walls into a continuous frontier defense, an ancestor of the Great Wall, built with conscript and convict labor under conditions that killed enormous numbers. He built himself a tomb complex guarded by an army of thousands of life-sized terracotta soldiers, each with an individually modeled face, which lay entirely unknown until farmers digging a well found them in 1974. And he is remembered in the traditional account for burning books and burying scholars alive. Modern historians treat those stories with real caution. They come mostly from the dynasty that overthrew him and had every reason to blacken him, and the details do not survive scrutiny well. Something repressive happened. The lurid version is probably partly propaganda. The first emperor spent his later years searching for an elixir of immortality. He died at 49, possibly poisoned by mercury compounds his physicians were feeding him as medicine. His empire, designed to last 10,000 generations, collapsed in rebellion within about 15 years of its founding. But it did not undo itself, and that distinction is the whole point. The dynasty that emerged from the wreckage, the Han, kept the Qin machinery almost entirely. The commanderies, the standardized script, the unified measures, the centralized bureaucracy. What they changed was the ideology on top of it. They dropped the pure legalist harshness and adopted Confucianism as the official framework of the state. That combination, a legalist administrative skeleton wearing Confucian clothes, became the operating system of imperial China for the next 2,000 years. The Han ruled for roughly 4 centuries. They pushed west and opened the trade routes we now call the Silk Road. That began with an envoy named Zhang, sent out to find military allies against the steppe nomads, who was captured and held for over a decade, escaped, continued his mission anyway, and came back after 13 years, with no alliance but with the first detailed Chinese account of the civilizations to the west. Within a few decades, Chinese silk was moving toward Rome, and goods, crops, and ideas were moving back. They built an imperial academy and a professional officialdom selected substantially on learning, an approach that eventually matured into the examination system that would define Chinese government for over a millennium. And they established an identity so durable that the overwhelming majority of Chinese people today, well over 90%, still identify as Han. Now come back to the river, because it never stopped. Every dynasty inherited the same physical problem. The silt keeps arriving, the bed keeps rising, the dikes must be maintained. A strong government could mobilize hundreds of thousands of laborers to hold the line. A weak one could not. And when the dikes failed, the flood killed vast numbers, the survivors starved, and rebels found it very easy to argue that heaven had withdrawn its mandate. Flood, famine, rebellion, new dynasty, repairs, recovery, and eventually decline again. The river is not just background scenery in Chinese history, it is one of the engines driving the cycle. So why did this one survive when the other 3 did not? There is no single clean answer, and anyone who offers you one is selling something. But a few things genuinely stand out. The writing never broke. Oracle bone script evolves into bronze inscriptions, into seal script, into clerical script, into the characters used today, in an unbroken line with no gap where the knowledge was lost. Because the script encodes meaning more than sound, it survived enormous changes in spoken language and remained readable across regions and centuries. There was never a moment where the whole tradition had to be recovered from scratch, because it was never dropped. The mandate of heaven gave collapse a script. When a dynasty failed, it was not the end of the civilization, it was a scheduled transfer. The framework survived the government. The bureaucracy was portable. An educated official class trained on a shared body of texts could be inherited by any new ruler, including foreign conquerors, who found it easier to use the existing machine than to build a new one. Conquerors who took China repeatedly ended up governing as Chinese emperors. And geography helped. Deserts, mountains, steppe and ocean gave China a degree of insulation that the Fertile Crescent, sitting at the crossroads of 3 continents, never had. None of this made China peaceful. Its civil wars are among the deadliest events in human history. It was invaded and ruled by outsiders more than once. It fragmented for centuries at a time. But the thread held. The Egyptians stopped being Egyptian in the old sense. The Sumerian language died. The Indus script went silent and stayed silent. And in China, the questions a king scratched onto a turtle shell 3,500 years ago, asking whether it would rain, whether his consort's childbirth would go well, whether his toothache was his ancestors' doing, can still be read today by people using the descendants of those same characters. 4 rivers. 3 of them buried their civilizations. One of them kept trying for 4,000 years and never quite managed it. But there is a 5th place, and it breaks the pattern entirely. It had no great river, it had no floodplain to organize, no annual inundation, no silt. What it had was a sea, scattered with islands, and a coastline so broken that no single power could easily control it. And it produced a collapse so complete that when it was over, the survivors had forgotten how to write. Palaces burned, cities emptied, and for roughly 4 centuries the region went dark until people began writing again in an entirely new script, borrowed from someone else, with no memory of the one they had lost. That's next.